My mom found my Spotify playlist, and then she made me have an exorcism. I was really into metal music in high school. Nothing extreme, just the kind of stuff with heavy guitars and dark imagery. My mom was super religious, but I never thought my music taste was a problem since I always kept my headphones on. But one day I came home from school and found her sitting on my bed holding my phone. She'd gone through it looking for something and found my Spotify playlists. Her face was red and streaked with tears. "What is this?" she asked, showing me song titles with words like devil and hell in them. I tried to explain that it was just music, that the themes were theatrical and not literal. She started sobbing and saying she'd failed as a mother, that evil had gotten to me and she didn't even notice. Within an hour, she'd called Pastor Rick from her church and demanded he come to the house immediately. He showed up with another leader from the congregation, and they sat me down at the kitchen table. They started asking me questions about what else I was into, whether I'd ever tried to contact spirits or attended any rituals. I kept trying to explain that I just liked the music because it sounded cool, but then they confiscated my phone and Pastor Rick found photos of a school project I'd done on Greek mythology for history class. There were pictures of my poster board with drawings of Hades and Medusa. "Greek gods," Pastor Rick said slowly. "You're studying false idols and pagan deities." I tried to explain it was a required assignment, but he talked over me. They went up to my room and started going through everything like detectives at a crime scene. They found my band t-shirts and posters. They found a fantasy novel on my nightstand with a dragon on the cover. Pastor Rick held it up. "Witchcraft and sorcery. This is teaching you to normalize demonic practices." He found a picture from a skit in school where I played a vampire and practically went into convulsions. My mom was crying harder now. My dad came home from work and found our living room full of people from the church who'd been called in. They'd laid out all my stuff on the coffee table. The band stuff, the mythology poster, the fantasy book, even a video game case that had a demon character on the cover. One of the leaders held up the game. "He's literally playing as demons. He's practicing their perspective." I tried to explain it was just a game where you fight the demons, but they weren't listening. Another elder found a rock I'd picked up on a hike because it was shaped cool. He turned it over in his hands. "Natural formations can be conduits for dark energy. Did you choose this specifically?" I said no, it was just a rock. Pastor Rick said everything was connected, that I'd been slowly corrupted over time and now I couldn't even see it. My dad looked at me like he didn't recognize me. Pastor Rick said we needed to take immediate action. My mom asked what they should do. He said, "We need to cleanse your home and remove any darkness that has taken hold of your son." The next evening, our house was full of people from the church. They'd rearranged our entire living room, pushing furniture against the walls and setting up chairs in a circle with one empty chair in the middle for me. There were maybe 20 adults there, all people I'd known my whole life. They'd brought candles and oil and were setting everything up like some kind of ritual. Pastor Rick told me to sit in the center chair. I sat down because I didn't know what else to do. He started by asking me to renounce the music and the symbols. I said fine. I'd delete the music if it would make everyone calm down. One of the women from the church stood up and pointed at me. "He's lying!" I can see it in his eyes. The darkness is speaking through him. Pastor Rick held up his hand for silence and then put it on my forehead. "We're not here to punish you. We're here to save you from the forces that have taken hold." Then they all started praying at once. It started quiet but got louder and louder until people were shouting. Some of them were speaking in tongues, making sounds I'd never heard. They surrounded my chair and put their hands on my head, my shoulders, my arms. I tried to stand up, but there were too many of them pushing me down. Pastor Rick's voice rose above everyone else's. "I command you to release this child. You have no power here." I started crying and said there was nothing to release, that I was just a kid who liked music. One of the elders shouted, "It's fighting back! We need to go stronger." They started chanting something together, all in unison, and the sound was overwhelming. My mom was in the circle too, crying and praying with her hands raised. I begged her to make them stop, but she wouldn't look at me. Pastor Rick pulled out a bottle of oil and started pouring it on my head. It ran down my face and into my eyes, and I couldn't see. He was shouting, "Leave this body! I cast you out in the name of all that is holy." One woman collapsed on the floor and started convulsing, screaming that she could feel the evil leaving me and entering her. 2 men had to hold her down. This went on for 3 hours. 3 hours of chanting and shouting and hands grabbing at me. My throat was raw from crying. Finally, Pastor Rick stepped back, breathing hard and sweating. "It's still in there. The corruption goes deeper than I thought." He turned to my parents. "There's a facility that can help him. A place that specializes in this level of spiritual intervention. You need to send him there immediately, or you're going to lose your son forever." Full story on the channel below. I spent that night locked in my room, too scared to sleep because every time I closed my eyes, I heard Pastor Rick's voice shouting about demons. My body ached from being held down for 3 hours. The oil in my hair had dried into a sticky mess that made my pillow crunch when I moved. I kept seeing their faces surrounding me, all those adults I'd known my whole life, and I couldn't understand how they thought what they did was okay. Around 3 in the morning, I finally passed out from being so tired. When I woke up a few hours later, my neck hurt from the weird angle I'd been sleeping at, and my eyes felt swollen from crying. I heard footsteps in the hallway, and my whole body went stiff. There was a knock on my door, and then Mom's voice calling my name in this cheerful tone that made my stomach turn. She came in carrying a plate of pancakes and asked if I slept well. I just stared at her because I couldn't believe she was acting like everything was normal. She set the plate on my desk and smiled, saying she made my favorite breakfast and that we should have a good day together. Her cheerful tone made me want to scream because she genuinely seemed to think last night helped me. I realized right then that she wasn't going to apologize or acknowledge how scary it was. She asked if I wanted to watch a movie with her later, and I said I had school. She looked disappointed but nodded and left the room. I couldn't eat the pancakes even though my stomach was empty. I got dressed and grabbed my backpack, moving quietly through the house because I didn't want to talk to anyone. Dad was already at work, and Mom was in the kitchen humming while she did dishes. I left without saying goodbye. At the school, I tried to act normal, but everything felt wrong. My hands wouldn't stop shaking, and I kept zoning out during first period. When second period started, my history teacher, Mr. Morris, raised his voice at someone in the back row for not paying attention. It wasn't even that loud, but the sound hit me like a punch, and suddenly I couldn't breathe. My chest got tight and the room started spinning. I stood up without asking and rushed out into the hallway. I made it to the bathroom and locked myself in a stall. My heart was pounding so hard I thought I might pass out. I tried to take deep breaths, but they came out all ragged and wrong. I heard the bathroom door open and footsteps coming toward my stall. Someone knocked and asked if I was okay. It was Isaac, my best friend since middle school. He must have followed me out of class. I tried to say I was fine, but my voice came out all shaky. Isaac asked what was wrong, and I wanted to tell him everything, but I couldn't make the words come out. How do you explain that your mom made you sit through an exorcism? It sounded crazy even in my own head. Isaac kept talking through the stall door, saying he knew something was up and that I could trust him. I finally unlocked the door and he saw my face and his eyes went wide. He asked what happened, and I just shook my head. We stood there in the bathroom for a few minutes while I tried to calm down. The bell rang for next period, but neither of us moved. Isaac said I should go to the nurse, but I told him I just needed a minute. He waited with me until I could breathe normally again, and then we went to our next classes. That afternoon, I came home and found Mom in my room going through my stuff again. She'd removed everything she thought was dangerous. My books were gone from the shelves. My posters had been torn down, leaving little pieces of tape stuck to the walls. Even my art supplies were missing from my desk. I asked what she was doing and she held up a sketchbook I'd forgotten about. She flipped it open to show me a drawing I'd done of a dragon for art class last month. Mom said she couldn't believe she'd missed this before, that the dragon imagery was clearly demonic. I tried to explain it was just a school assignment, but she wasn't listening. She'd put everything in garbage bags by the door. I saw my fantasy novels, my band t-shirts, even a poster of a video game I liked. She said the house needed to be cleansed of all dark influences, and that she was doing this to protect me. I felt sick looking at all my stuff in those bags like trash. Mom hugged me and said she knew this was hard, but that I'd thank her someday when I understood how close I'd come to real danger. I stood there frozen while she carried the bags downstairs. I heard the back door open and close. She was throwing everything away. Dad got home from work around 6, and I waited until Mom was busy in the kitchen before pulling him aside. We went into his office and I shut the door. I tried to explain that the music was just music and that the mythology project was required for school. Dad listened, but his face looked tired and stressed. He kept saying Mom was just worried about my soul, like that made everything okay. I asked if he thought the exorcism was right, and he was quiet for a long time. Finally, he said he didn't know what to think anymore, but that Mom was scared and he had to support her. I wanted to yell at him that I was scared too, but I could see he wasn't going to help me. He put his hand on my shoulder and said we'd get through this as a family. Then he left the office to help Mom with dinner. I sat there feeling completely alone. During dinner, the phone rang and Dad answered it. His whole body language changed and he took the phone into the living room. I could hear him talking in a low voice, and then Mom got up to join him. I stayed at the table pushing food around my plate and trying to hear what they were saying. Mom started crying and Dad's voice got more serious. The call went on for over an hour. I knew it was Pastor Rick talking to them about the facility he'd mentioned. My hands started shaking again and I had to put my fork down. When they finally came back to the kitchen, both their faces looked different, harder somehow. Mom's eyes were red from crying and Dad wouldn't look at me. They sat down at the table and Mom reached for my hand. I pulled away. Dad cleared his throat and said they needed to talk to me about something important. My stomach dropped because I knew what was coming. Mom started talking about how much they loved me and how they wanted to help me. She said Pastor Rick had found a special program that could give me the spiritual support I needed. Dad added that it was in another state and that I'd be staying there for a while. I asked what kind of program, and Mom said it was a Christian residential facility for teens struggling with spiritual issues. She called it a chance for intensive healing. Dad said Pastor Rick had already made the arrangements and that they'd put down a deposit to hold my spot. I asked how long I'd have to be there, and Mom looked at Dad before answering. She said however long it took, maybe 3 months, or maybe 6. The vague timeline made my chest tight again. I realized they could keep me there as long as they wanted if I didn't convince them I was fixed. I asked when I'd have to go, and Dad said in 2 weeks. 2 weeks. I had 2 weeks before they shipped me off to some place I'd never heard of. Mom said they'd visit me and that I could write letters home. She made it sound like summer camp instead of what it really was. I asked if I had any choice, and Dad said no, that this was what was best for me. Mom started crying again and said she couldn't lose me to darkness. I got up from the table and went to my room. Nobody tried to stop me. I lay on my bed staring at the ceiling for a long time. Then I remembered I still had my laptop. Mom hadn't thought to take it yet. I grabbed it and opened the browser, searching for the facility name Dad had mentioned. The official website looked normal with photos of smiling teens doing activities and talk of spiritual growth and personal development. But when I searched the facility's actual name with words like review or testimony, different results came up. I found a forum where former residents shared their experiences. Most of them were bad. Really bad. They talked about being isolated and forced to pray for hours without breaks. One person described being put in a small room alone for days because they questioned the program. Another said the staff went through all their personal belongings and read their journals out loud to the group. I kept reading even though each story made me feel worse. The program claimed to help teens, but the testimonies made it sound more like punishment. One testimony stood out because it was really detailed. A guy named Evan Harding had been sent there by his parents for being gay. He wrote about the daily schedule that started at 5 in the morning with mandatory prayer. He described being forced to stand in prayer position for hours until his legs shook. He talked about staff members who yelled at residents and told them they were broken and corrupted. Evan said they weren't allowed bathroom breaks during prayer sessions, and that some kids wet themselves rather than face punishment for asking. He wrote about isolation rooms where they put anyone who questioned the program or broke minor rules. He'd spent 3 days in one of those rooms with nothing but a Bible and a blanket. The worst part was how he described leaving the facility after 4 months. He said his parents thought he was cured, but really he'd just learned to lie and pretend so he could get out. His words made my hands shake as I read them. This was really happening. My parents were going to send me to this place. I kept reading testimonies until my eyes hurt from the screen light. Every story confirmed what I already knew deep down. This wasn't about helping me. This was about breaking me until I said what they wanted to hear. The next day at the school, I walked through the halls like I was moving through water. Everything felt slow and far away. My body was there, but my brain was stuck on those testimonies, on Evan's words about being broken down until he learned to lie. In first period math, I stared at the textbook without seeing any numbers. The teacher called on me twice before I even heard her voice. When I looked up, everyone was staring and I had no idea what the question was. I mumbled something about not knowing, and she moved on with this worried look. Second period English was worse because we were supposed to be discussing a book I hadn't read. I sat in the back and tried to make myself invisible. My hands wouldn't stop shaking, so I kept them under the desk. Every time someone laughed or raised their voice, I flinched. By third period, Isaac noticed something was really wrong. He sat next to me in history and kept glancing over while the teacher talked about World War I. I was supposed to be taking notes, but my page was blank. When the bell rang, Isaac grabbed my arm before I could leave. He asked what was going on and if I was okay. I told him I was fine, but my voice came out weird and shaky. He didn't believe me. He said I looked like I hadn't slept in days and that I'd been acting strange all week. I wanted to tell him, but the words felt stuck. We walked to the cafeteria and he bought us both lunch even though I said I wasn't hungry. We sat at our usual table in the corner and he waited. Finally, I just started talking. I told him about my mom finding my music and calling Pastor Rick. I told him about the exorcism and the hours of people holding me down and shouting. I showed him the bruises on my arms that were turning yellow and green. I told him about the facility and the testimonies I'd read online. Isaac's face went pale and then red. He looked at the bruises and then at me and asked if I was serious. I nodded and felt tears starting but pushed them back. He said that was abuse and that I needed to tell someone right away. I explained that my parents thought they were saving me and that everyone at church supported what they did. Isaac said he didn't care what they thought, that what happened was wrong and dangerous. He pulled out his phone and started looking something up. He told me about the school counselor, Ms. Landry, and said she'd helped his friend Jake last year when Jake's dad was hitting him. I felt my chest get tight because I didn't know if she'd believe me or if she'd just call my parents. Isaac insisted she was good at her job and that she'd actually listen. He said if I didn't talk to her, he would because he couldn't just watch me get sent away to some place that sounded like a prison. I agreed to go see her during lunch because I didn't have any better ideas. Ms. Landry's office was in the guidance wing near the front of the school. I knocked and she called for me to come in. She was maybe 40 with short brown hair and glasses. Her office had plants on the windowsill and posters about college on the walls. She smiled and asked what she could help me with. I sat down in the chair across from her desk and tried to figure out where to start. My throat felt tight and I couldn't make words come out right. She waited patiently and didn't rush me. Finally, I just rolled up my sleeves and showed her my arms. The bruises were obvious, dark finger marks where people had grabbed me. She leaned forward and her expression changed completely. She asked what happened and her voice was gentle, but I could see anger in her eyes. I explained the whole thing while staring at my hands. I told her about the music and Pastor Rick and the exorcism that went on for 3 hours. I told her about the facility my parents wanted to send me to and the testimonies I'd found online. She listened without interrupting and took notes on a yellow pad. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she asked when I was supposed to go to the facility. I said my parents hadn't given me an exact date, but that they'd already put down a deposit. She nodded and wrote something else down. She explained that she was a mandatory reporter, which meant she had to contact Child Protective Services when she learned about abuse. I felt panic rise up in my chest. I asked if there was any way to avoid that because I was scared of making everything worse. She said she understood my fear, but that sending me to an unregulated facility could put me in serious danger. She explained that some of these places had no oversight, and that kids had been hurt or even died at similar programs. I started crying then and couldn't stop. She handed me tissues and waited until I calmed down. That afternoon, I was sitting in class when the front office called me down. Ms. Landry was there with a woman in business clothes who introduced herself as Ms. Rodriguez from Child Protective Services. They took me to a private conference room, and Ms. Rodriguez explained she needed to ask me some questions. I went through everything again, and it felt harder the second time. My voice kept breaking, and I had to stop to breathe. Ms. Rodriguez was calm and professional. She asked specific questions about who was there and what they did and how long it lasted. She asked about the bruises and took photos with her phone from multiple angles. She asked about the facility and I showed her the testimonies I'd saved on my phone. She wrote everything down in a notebook with detailed notes. When we finished, she explained that CPS would need to investigate before they could intervene. That meant they'd have to talk to my parents and to Pastor Rick. I begged her not to tell them I was the one who reported it. I was scared of what they'd do when they found out. She said she understood, but that the investigation had to move forward to protect me. She promised they'd be careful, but she couldn't guarantee my parents wouldn't figure out the report came from the school. I felt sick to my stomach as I walked back to class. That evening I went home knowing CPS would contact my parents soon. Dinner was tense even though nobody said anything was wrong. Mom made pot roast and kept asking if I liked it. I pushed food around my plate and said it was good. Dad talked about work and some project he was managing. I tried to act normal, but my hands shook when I picked up my fork. Mom noticed and asked if I was feeling okay. I said I was just tired from the school. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. She said she knew everything had been hard lately, but that it was all for the best. I nodded and excused myself to go do homework. I lay on my bed staring at the ceiling and listening to the house sounds. Every car that drove by made me tense up thinking it might be CPS. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning I was getting ready for school when the doorbell rang. It was early, maybe 7. I heard Dad answer and then voices in the living room. I opened my door and heard a woman saying they were from Child Protective Services. Mom's voice got high and scared. She asked what this was about. Dad demanded to know who made a report. I stayed in my room with my door cracked, listening to everything. One of the workers explained they were investigating concerns about my welfare. Mom immediately called Pastor Rick. Dad kept saying this was ridiculous and that they were good parents. The workers asked to speak with my parents separately. They put Mom in the kitchen and Dad stayed in the living room. I could hear Mom crying and talking about trying to save my soul. She said they'd done everything out of love and that the church supported their decision. When they finished with my parents, one of the workers came upstairs and knocked on my door. She was younger than Miss Rodriguez with blonde hair pulled back. She asked if we could talk and I let her in. She asked me to tell her what happened and I went through it all again. I showed her the bruises that were fading but still visible. She looked at my wrists and noticed new marks that were darker and fresher. She asked about those and I explained that Mom had grabbed me too hard yesterday when I tried to leave the dinner table. The worker took more photos and wrote everything down. After the workers left, the house felt like it might explode. Dad paced the living room in his work clothes, saying this could ruin his reputation. He kept asking how people would react when they found out CPS came to our house. Mom was sobbing on the couch, saying the government was attacking them for their faith. She said they were being persecuted just like the early Christians. Dad said we needed to call their lawyer. Mom said we needed to call Pastor Rick back. I stayed in my room listening to them panic and feeling guilty even though I knew I'd done the right thing. Less than an hour later, the doorbell rang again. I heard Mom answer, and then Pastor Rick's voice in the hallway. She led him to the kitchen and closed the door, but I could still hear most of what they said through the heating vent in my room. Pastor Rick told them not to worry, that the church would stand behind them completely. He said CPS investigations happen all the time to religious families because the government doesn't understand spiritual matters. Mom was crying and asking if they did something wrong. Pastor Rick said no, they did exactly what any loving parent would do when their child was in danger. He explained that secular authorities see deliverance ministry as abuse because they don't believe in spiritual warfare. Dad asked what they should do if CPS kept investigating. Pastor Rick said to document everything, to show that I was healthy and cared for, and to emphasize their religious freedom rights. He said the church had a lawyer who specialized in these cases and could help if needed. The meeting went on for 2 hours. I sat on my bed the whole time listening and feeling sick. They weren't talking about whether the exorcism was wrong. They were talking about how to defend it. After Pastor Rick left, the house got quiet. I heard Mom go to their bedroom and Dad stayed downstairs. Around 9 that night, Dad knocked on my door and came in without waiting for an answer. He sat on the edge of my bed and looked completely worn out. His shirt was wrinkled and he had dark circles under his eyes. He asked why I went to the school counselor instead of talking to him about how I was feeling. I stared at him for a second because I couldn't believe he was asking that. I reminded him that I tried to talk to him the night of the exorcism, and he just said Mom was worried about my soul. I tried to explain the music was just music, and he sided with Pastor Rick. Dad rubbed his face with both hands and didn't say anything for a long time. The silence stretched out until it felt heavy in the room. Finally, Dad spoke again and his voice was quieter. He admitted he'd been uncomfortable with how intense things got during the exorcism. He said when that woman collapsed and started screaming, he almost stopped everything, but Pastor Rick seemed so sure about what needed to happen. Dad looked at me and said he loved me and didn't want to lose me. But then he said he was also scared of failing as a father if he didn't support Mom's beliefs about spiritual protection. He said Mom's faith was important to her, and he didn't want to undermine it. I could see he was torn, but that didn't make me feel better because being torn meant he still might side with her again. I saw a tiny chance to get through to him, so I chose my words carefully. I explained that I wasn't possessed or evil, that I was just a teenager who liked music they didn't understand. I said the mythology project was for school and the fantasy books were just stories. I told him I was the same kid I'd always been, and nothing about me had changed except now I was terrified of my own parents. Dad's eyes got watery and he reached over to squeeze my shoulder. He said he needed time to think about everything. Then he stood up and left my room without saying goodnight. I lay back down and stared at the ceiling, wondering if anything I said made a difference. The next few days were awful. Nobody talked about the CPS visit directly, but the tension made the whole house feel like it might explode any second. I heard Mom on the phone with the facility canceling our deposit. She told them it was temporary and they'd reschedule once some family issues were resolved. When she hung up, she came to my room and made it clear the cancellation didn't mean they'd changed their minds. She said as soon as CPS finished their investigation and saw I was fine, they'd send me to the program. I nodded because arguing would only make things worse. Dad went to work and came home late every night. Mom watched me constantly. On the 3rd day after the CPS visit, I came home from the school and found Mom in my room going through my stuff again. She was sitting at my desk with my laptop open looking at my browser history. When she saw me in the doorway, her face turned red and she stood up fast. She demanded to know why I'd been researching the facility and reading reviews from former residents. I tried to explain I just wanted to know what to expect, but she started yelling. She said I was trying to sabotage my own healing by looking for negative information. She accused me of wanting to stay sick and corrupted instead of accepting help. I told her I wasn't sick and she slammed my laptop shut, so hard I thought the screen might crack. Mom said I clearly couldn't be trusted with technology if I was going to use it to undermine their authority. She unplugged my laptop and picked it up along with my phone that was charging on my nightstand. I asked her to please not take them because I needed my phone for school and to talk to my friends. She said I could use the house phone if I needed to call someone for homework, and that was it. She walked out of my room carrying both devices, and I heard her lock them in her bedroom. I felt completely cut off from everything. I couldn't text Isaac or look anything up or even listen to music to calm down. The isolation made everything 10 times worse. At the school the next day, I was exhausted from not sleeping. Ms. Landry saw me in the hallway between classes and asked how I was doing. I must have looked terrible because she told me to come to her office during lunch. When I got there, she had me sit down and asked what was happening at home. I explained that Mom took my laptop and phone and was watching me all the time. Ms. Landry looked concerned and said she wanted to help. She turned her office computer toward me and said I could use it to email anyone I needed to contact. I thought about Isaac, but realized email wouldn't help much with daily stuff. Then I remembered my cousin Mia, who left our church 5 years ago. Mom always said Mia was a bad influence and we weren't supposed to talk to her much. But Mia was family and she'd understand what our church was like. I logged into my email and sent her a long message explaining everything that happened. I checked my email again after school the next day using Miss Landry's computer. Mia had already responded and her message was long and angry. She said she couldn't believe they did an exorcism on me and that it was completely wrong. She told me she went through similar pressure from the church when she was my age because she questioned some of their teachings. Her parents, my aunt and uncle, ended up leaving the church over it. Mia said if CPS or the courts would allow it, I could come stay with her family. She lived about 3 hours away in a bigger city and said her parents would be happy to take me in. Reading her message made me cry in Miss Landry's office because it was the first time in weeks someone from my family said I wasn't the problem. That evening I was in my room doing homework when I heard the house phone ring downstairs. Dad answered and I heard him say hello to someone. Then his voice got tense and he said Roger's name. Roger was Mia's dad, my uncle on Dad's side. I crept to the top of the stairs to listen. Roger was apparently calling about what happened to me and Dad sounded defensive. I heard Dad say they were doing what they thought was best and Roger needed to stay out of it. Then Mom grabbed the phone and started yelling. She said Roger abandoned God years ago and now he was trying to corrupt me too. She screamed that he had no right to judge their parenting when he let his own daughter turn away from the church. Roger must have said something about taking me because Mom shrieked that he'd never get custody, that they were my parents and I was staying with them. Dad took the phone back and told Roger not to call again. Then he hung up. Mom was crying and saying Roger always caused problems. Dad looked shaken. I went back to my room before they saw me on the stairs. The fight meant my family was splitting apart over this, and I didn't know if that made things better or worse. The next morning, my grandmother called. I heard Mom answer and then start crying again, and when I came downstairs, Mom was nodding and saying thank you over and over. After she hung up, she looked relieved for the first time in days. She told Dad that Grandma completely supported them and said Roger had no right to interfere in how they raised me. Grandma apparently said Roger turned his back on God years ago, and now he was trying to poison their family too. Mom seemed energized by the support, like having Grandma on her side proved they were doing the right thing. But that afternoon, Dad's sister, my Aunt Karen, called his cell phone. He took it in the garage and I watched through the window as he paced back and forth, his face getting more and more troubled. When he came back inside, he looked shaken. He told Mom that Karen said she was worried about me and thought the exorcism went too far. Mom's face went red and she started yelling about how everyone was turning against them. Dad tried to calm her down, but she was furious that even his own sister was questioning their judgment. I felt caught in the middle of this family war where everyone was picking sides, and I was just the reason they were all fighting. 2 days later, the CPS caseworker came back to our house with another person. They interviewed my parents again and then talked to me separately in my room. The caseworker asked how I was doing and if I felt safe at home. I told her I was scared my parents would send me to that facility as soon as CPS stopped watching. She wrote everything down and looked concerned but not surprised. After they left, my parents sat in the kitchen for over an hour waiting for the phone to ring. When the caseworker finally called back, Dad put it on speaker. She said they'd completed their investigation and determined that while the exorcism was very concerning, my parents hadn't committed abuse that required removing me from the home because I wasn't in immediate physical danger. Mom started crying with relief, but the caseworker wasn't done talking. She said they were strongly recommending family therapy and warning my parents that if they tried to send me to the facility, it would trigger another investigation immediately. She said CPS would be checking in regularly over the next few months. After the call ended, Mom and Dad looked at each other with this mixture of relief and frustration. They'd been cleared, but they also couldn't do what they wanted with me anymore. The next day, Mom and Dad went somewhere without telling me where. They were gone for 3 hours, and when they came back, Dad was carrying a folder of papers. They'd hired a lawyer, some guy who specialized in religious freedom cases. Over dinner, Dad explained that the lawyer said they had the right to raise me according to their beliefs, and that CPS couldn't stop them from practicing their religion. But the lawyer also warned that the facility could be legally problematic if it wasn't properly licensed and regulated. He told them to be very careful about where they sent me because if something went wrong there, they could face serious legal consequences. Mom looked frustrated because she wanted to send me away immediately, but now even their own lawyer was telling them to slow down. Dad seemed more uncertain, like maybe he was starting to question whether this was really the right path. That Sunday, Pastor held a special meeting at church after the regular service. My parents made me go even though I begged to stay home. Pastor stood at the front and told the whole congregation that our family was under attack from secular authorities who wanted to stop us from saving our children's souls. He said the government was trying to interfere with religious freedom and that we all needed to stand together against this persecution. People were nodding and saying amen, and I felt sick sitting there while he made my family sound like victims. After the meeting ended, several church members came up to my parents and hugged them and promised to pray for us. Over the next few days, these people started showing up at our house. They'd come by in the evening to pray in our living room or bring us meals or just sit with my parents and talk about spiritual warfare. Every time the doorbell rang, I felt more trapped because our house was filling up with people who all thought I was the problem. I couldn't go anywhere without running into some church member who'd look at me with this mixture of pity and concern, like I was sick and didn't know it. One evening, about a week later, there was a knock on my bedroom door. I opened it expecting Mom or Dad, but it was Eliza, the youth pastor from church. She was younger than most of the other church leaders, maybe late 20s, and she'd always been nicer to me than the others. She asked if we could talk privately, and I let her in, confused about why she was there. She sat on my desk chair, and I sat on my bed, and for a minute neither of us said anything. Then she asked if I was okay, really okay, and something about the way she said it made my throat tight. I tried to say I was fine, but my voice cracked. She waited and didn't push, and finally I just started talking. I told her everything about how scared I was during the exorcism, how betrayed I felt that Mom let it happen, how I couldn't sleep anymore without having nightmares about people holding me down. I told her I was terrified they'd send me away and I'd never come back. I was crying by the end, and Eliza handed me tissues from my desk. She was quiet for a long time after I finished, just sitting there looking sad. Then she said something I didn't expect. She said she didn't think the exorcism was appropriate, that Jesus taught love and compassion, not fear and force. She said she'd been troubled by what happened but didn't know how to speak up because Pastor was so certain it was necessary. Hearing her say that made me feel less alone than I had in weeks, like maybe I wasn't crazy for thinking what they did was wrong. But the next day, Eliza tried to talk to Pastor about her concerns, and it went badly. I only know because she came by again that evening looking upset. She told me she'd gone to Pastor and expressed her doubts about the methods used during my exorcism. He'd shut her down immediately, saying she was too young to understand spiritual warfare, and that her compassion was manipulated by dark forces. He told her that questioning the exorcism was the same as supporting my corruption, and he warned her that if she kept spreading doubt, she'd be removed from her youth pastor position. Eliza looked shaken when she told me this. She said she was sorry she couldn't do more to help, but that she'd be there if I needed to talk. I thanked her, but inside I felt hopeless again because even the one person in the church who seemed to understand couldn't actually change anything. The mandatory therapy sessions started the following week. The therapist's office was in a building downtown, and we had to go every Tuesday evening. The first session was just my parents and me sitting on this couch while the therapist, a woman in her 40s, asked us to explain why we were there. Dad started talking about their concerns for my spiritual well-being and how they'd been trying to address my interest in dark materials. Mom jumped in and talked about the music and the mythology project and how they realized I needed intervention. The therapist listened and took notes and then asked me for my perspective. I tried to explain that I just liked music and that the school project was required, but every time I talked, Mom or Dad would interrupt to add context or correct what I said. I sat there feeling like my voice didn't matter at all because they kept framing everything as spiritual, rather than acknowledging what they actually did to me. The therapist noticed and asked my parents to let me finish speaking, but even then the session felt pointless because we were talking past each other instead of actually communicating. During the third therapy session, the therapist asked Mom directly if she understood that the exorcism frightened me. Mom's eyes filled with tears and she nodded. She said of course she knew it was scary, that it was scary for her too. But then she said that sometimes saving someone requires difficult actions, like how surgery is painful but necessary to remove something dangerous. She said the short-term fear was worth it if it meant protecting my eternal soul. Dad put his hand on her knee and nodded like he agreed. I felt my stomach turn because she still didn't get it. She was still comparing what they did to medical treatment, like it was the same thing. The therapist leaned forward and gently challenged Mom's comparison. She pointed out that surgery is performed by licensed professionals with informed consent and medical oversight. She said what happened to me was done by people with no psychological training, without my consent, and with no oversight to ensure my safety. Mom's face changed and she got defensive. She said secular therapists like her didn't understand spiritual matters, that there were things beyond psychology that required faith-based approaches. The therapist stayed calm and said she wasn't questioning their faith, just the methods used and the impact on me. But I could see we weren't making real progress. Mom and Dad weren't ready to admit they'd done anything wrong, and the therapist couldn't force them to see it differently. I left that session feeling exhausted and hopeless, knowing these Tuesday meetings weren't going to fix anything. The next day at the school, Isaac caught up with me between classes and pulled me aside near the lockers. He looked around to make sure no one was listening, and then told me his parents had talked about my situation. They said if things got really bad at home, I could stay with them for a while. I felt this wave of gratitude mixed with fear, because accepting that offer might make everything worse with my parents. I thanked Isaac but said I didn't know if I could do that, if running away would just prove to them that I was the problem. Isaac looked frustrated and said it wasn't running away, it was protecting myself, but I could see in his eyes that he understood why I was scared. We went to class and I spent the whole period thinking about whether I was being smart or just a coward for not taking the offer. 2 weeks crawled by with more therapy sessions that went nowhere. Then one Tuesday evening, my parents called me down to the living room and sat me on the couch between them. Mom had papers in her lap and Dad looked tired but determined. Mom explained they'd found a different program, one that was properly licensed and accredited with real counselors. She said even the therapist had mentioned that some space might help us all get perspective, though I wasn't sure if the therapist actually said that, or if Mom was interpreting things her own way. Dad added that this facility was nothing like the first one, that it had educational components and licensed staff and state oversight. They showed me the brochure with photos of clean buildings and smiling teenagers sitting in group circles. Mom kept saying it was legitimate, using that word over and over like she was trying to convince herself as much as me. They said I'd start in 3 weeks if I agreed to go, and the way they phrased it made it sound like I had a choice, but their faces told me I really didn't. That night, I used Miss Landry's office computer the next day to research the new facility since my parents still had my laptop and phone. The website looked professional with credentials and licenses posted prominently. They had licensed therapists on staff and an actual school program, so residents wouldn't fall behind academically. But when I dug deeper into reviews from former residents, I found concerning patterns. Multiple people described constant guilt and shame tactics disguised as therapy. One review said counselors would make residents confess sins in front of the group, and then other teens would have to explain why those sins hurt God. Another former resident wrote about being isolated from family for weeks as punishment for questioning the program's methods. The religious focus was heavy, even though they claimed to be clinical, with mandatory prayer sessions and Bible study mixed into the therapeutic schedule. I printed out several reviews and hid them in my backpack, feeling sick as I read them. The weight of the decision pressed down on me constantly over the next few days. I could go along with the facility to keep some kind of peace with my parents, or I could fight back and maybe destroy our relationship forever. Every time I thought about it, my stomach hurt and I couldn't eat much at meals. Mom noticed and asked if I was getting sick, and I just said I was stressed about school. At night, I'd lie in bed running through scenarios in my head, imagining what would happen if I refused to go, if I called CPS again, if I took Isaac up on his offer to stay with his family. Each option seemed to lead to more pain and conflict. I started losing weight because food tasted like nothing, and my appetite disappeared completely. Dad commented on it one morning, and I snapped at him that maybe constant stress wasn't good for a person's health, and he looked hurt but didn't argue. I went to Miss Landry's office during lunch and asked to talk. She closed her door and sat across from me while I explained the new facility and my confusion about what to do. Miss Landry listened carefully, and then explained that at my age, I had limited legal rights, but that my preferences would matter if custody ever became an issue. She said the courts would consider my wishes, especially since I was old enough to articulate my needs clearly. Then she leaned forward and asked what I wanted. Really wanted. Not what would keep the peace or make my parents happy. I felt tears start and tried to hold them back, but couldn't. I told her I just wanted my parents to love me without trying to change who I am, that I wanted them to see me as their kid instead of a problem to fix. Ms. Landry nodded and said that was completely reasonable, that wanting unconditional love from your parents wasn't asking too much. She suggested I try writing everything down in a letter, that sometimes people can hear things better when they read them in private without the pressure of immediate response. That night, I sat at my desk with notebook paper and started writing. My hand shook as I formed the words, but I kept going. I described exactly how the exorcism made me feel, the terror of being held down by adults I trusted, the betrayal of my mom standing there praying instead of protecting me. I wrote about the oil burning my eyes and the hours of people shouting at me like I was something evil that needed to be cast out. I explained my fear that they cared more about their religion than my well-being, that they'd rather have a broken kid who believed the right things than a healthy kid who thought differently. I told them I understood they thought they were saving me, but that their actions traumatized me instead, that I still had nightmares about that night. The letter ran 3 pages front and back by the time I finished. I folded it carefully and put it in an envelope with their names on the front. The next morning before school, I left the letter on the kitchen table where they'd see it. My hands trembled as I set it down, and I almost grabbed it back but forced myself to leave it there. School dragged by in a blur because I couldn't stop thinking about them reading it. When the final bell rang, I walked home slowly, dreading what I'd find. I opened the front door and saw both my parents sitting at the kitchen table with red eyes. The letter sat between them, unfolded and wrinkled like they'd read it multiple times. Dad looked up at me and his voice cracked when he said they'd read it 3 times. Mom was crying so hard she could barely speak, her shoulders shaking with sobs. I stood in the doorway not knowing whether to run or sit down. Dad gestured to the empty chair and I sat carefully, keeping my hands in my lap. He started talking in this quiet, broken voice I'd never heard from him before. He said they never meant to hurt me, that they genuinely believed they were saving me from something dangerous. His eyes filled with tears as he admitted they got caught up in Pastor Rick's certainty, that the way he talked made it seem so clear and urgent that they didn't stop to think about what their actions would do to me psychologically. Dad said he kept replaying that night in his head, seeing it from my perspective instead of theirs, and it made him feel sick. He reached across the table like he wanted to take my hand, but stopped himself, maybe sensing I wasn't ready for that. Mom finally managed to speak through her crying. She said she'd been praying constantly since the CPS investigation, asking God if they did the right thing. Her voice shook as she admitted she'd been having doubts because I seemed more traumatized than healed. She looked at me with red, swollen eyes and said she didn't know how to reconcile her faith with the damage she saw in my eyes every day. Mom said she believed God wanted her to protect me, but that maybe she'd confused protection with control, that maybe her fear had made her do things God never asked her to do. She wiped her face with a tissue, but the tears kept coming. She said reading my words about feeling betrayed broke something inside her because she never wanted me to feel that way, that a mother's job was to be a safe place, and she'd failed at that. We sat at that table for hours as the afternoon light faded into evening. I explained that my music taste didn't mean I worshipped the devil, that the lyrics were theatrical storytelling, not literal beliefs. I told them mythology was just history, that studying ancient cultures didn't mean rejecting our own faith. I said I was still the same kid they raised, that liking heavy guitars and fantasy books didn't change who I was at my core. They listened without interrupting for the first time since this whole thing started. Mom asked questions about the music, actually wanting to understand instead of just condemning it. Dad admitted he'd never actually listened to any of it, that he'd just trusted Pastor Rick's interpretation. I could see them really hearing me, trying to understand my perspective instead of just defending their own actions. It wasn't perfect, and there were still moments of tension when their religious fears surfaced, but something had shifted. They were seeing me as a person with valid feelings instead of a problem that needed fixing. Dad stood up from the table and walked to the phone in the kitchen, and I watched him dial the number for the facility while Mom sat frozen in her chair. He waited for someone to answer, then spoke calmly about needing to cancel the enrollment they'd arranged. Mom's face went pale, and her hands started shaking, but she didn't say anything to stop him. Dad explained to whoever was on the phone that they'd decided to handle things as a family instead, and when he hung up, he turned to Mom and told her firmly that they weren't sending me away. Mom opened her mouth like she wanted to argue, but then she just nodded and wiped her eyes. I felt something loosen in my chest, like I'd been holding my breath for weeks and could finally exhale. That night, I actually slept without nightmares for the first time since the exorcism. The next afternoon, I was in my room doing homework when the phone rang downstairs. I heard Dad answer it, then his voice got more formal, and I knew it was someone from church. I crept to the top of the stairs and listened as Dad talked to Pastor. Dad stayed respectful but firm, explaining that they appreciated all the counsel, but needed to take a break and figure things out on their own. Pastor's voice got louder on the other end, loud enough that I could hear him asking if Dad understood the spiritual danger he was putting me in. Dad said they'd made their decision, and that they needed some space right now. When he hung up, I heard Mom crying in the kitchen. I stayed upstairs but felt this tiny spark of hope, because Dad had actually stood up to Pastor instead of just going along with whatever he said. That Sunday morning felt weird. I woke up and realized my parents weren't getting ready for church, and I came downstairs to find them just sitting in the living room in their regular clothes. Mom looked lost, like she didn't know what to do with herself. We sat in this awkward silence for a while, nobody knowing what to say or do. Finally, Dad suggested we go get breakfast somewhere, just the three of us. Mom hesitated but agreed, and we drove to this diner we used to go to sometimes when I was younger. The whole car ride was quiet except for the radio playing softly. At the diner, we sat in a booth by the window and ordered food. Mom barely touched her pancakes, just pushed them around her plate with her fork. Then she started talking, her voice shaky. She said she was sorry for scaring me and for not protecting me during the exorcism. Her apology wasn't perfect because she kept saying things like how she was just trying to save my soul and how she thought she was doing the right thing. But she actually used the word sorry, which was more than I expected. She admitted she should have stopped things when I was crying and begging, that a mother's job is to protect her child even from church people. Dad reached over and squeezed her hand, and I saw tears running down her face. I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded and said okay. It wasn't enough to fix everything, but it was a start. Over the next few weeks, we started going to a different church that one of Dad's coworkers recommended. This church was way less intense, with a younger pastor who talked more about helping people and showing love instead of constantly warning about demons and spiritual warfare. The music was different too, more modern and less about fire and judgment. Mom struggled with the change at first, saying it felt too casual and not serious enough about sin. But after a few Sundays, she admitted that she felt less anxious there, that she didn't leave service feeling scared and guilty like she used to. She even said maybe she needed a healthier place to work through her own religious trauma, which surprised me because I didn't think she saw it that way. We kept going to family therapy every week, and slowly the sessions got more productive. My parents stopped treating the therapist like she was attacking their faith and started actually listening to what she said. The therapist helped them understand that they could keep their beliefs while still respecting my right to make my own choices. She explained that forcing religious practices on me, especially after the trauma of the exorcism, was just going to push me further away. Mom cried a lot during these sessions, but she also started asking real questions about how to repair our relationship. Dad talked about feeling caught between his faith and his role as a father, and the therapist helped him see that protecting me was part of his faith, not against it. One evening after therapy, Dad came to my room carrying my phone and laptop. He handed them to me and said I could have them back, but that we needed to agree on some boundaries. He said they wouldn't monitor everything I did anymore, but that I needed to be honest with them about my interests. I could listen to my music and read my books and play my games, but if they asked about something, I should be willing to explain it instead of hiding it. I agreed because it felt fair, and because I was just so relieved to have my stuff back. That night, I put my headphones on and listened to my playlist for the first time in over a month, and it felt like getting a piece of myself back. Thanksgiving came and Mia and Roger drove up to visit. I was nervous because the last few times they'd visited, Mom had made these passive-aggressive comments about their lifestyle choices and how they'd turned away from God. But this time, Mom was different. She hugged Mia at the door and actually seemed happy to see her. During dinner, Mom and Roger talked about normal stuff like work and the weather, and at one point I heard them both laughing about some story from when they were kids. It wasn't perfect, and there were still some tense moments, but it was the closest to a normal family dinner we'd had in years. After they left, Mom said it felt good to reconnect with family, that she'd missed her brother. Through all of this, Isaac stayed my best friend and never made me feel weird about what happened. He checked on me every day at the school and listened when I needed to talk about it. Having him there made it easier to process everything because he didn't judge me or try to fix things. He just listened and reminded me that none of it was my fault. I found myself able to talk about the exorcism without completely falling apart, and I started trusting my own judgment again instead of second-guessing everything. Isaac helped me see that I could recover from this, that the trauma didn't have to define my whole life. 3 months after the exorcism, I saw a flyer at the school for the music club and decided to join. I was nervous about it because I'd spent so long hiding my interests, but I made myself go to the first meeting. I met other kids who were into the same bands I liked, and we talked about music and shared playlists. I made some new friends who got excited about the same stuff I did, and it felt amazing to not have to pretend or hide. When I told my parents about the club, They asked if they could meet my new friends. I brought a couple of them over one afternoon, and my parents seemed genuinely surprised that they were just normal teenagers who did homework and played video games and talked about regular stuff. One of my friends even mentioned going to church with his family, which seemed to help my parents see that you could like metal music and still be a good person. After my friends left, Dad said he was glad I'd found people who shared my interests, and Mom said they seemed like nice kids. It was a small thing, but it meant a lot, because it showed my parents were actually trying to understand instead of just assuming the worst. A few weeks later, Mom told me she'd scheduled an appointment with a therapist who specialized in religious trauma. I was surprised because she'd always said therapy was for people who didn't have enough faith, but she admitted she needed help processing her own fears and beliefs. She started going every week, and I could see small changes in how she talked about things. One evening, she sat with me in the living room and explained that her therapist was helping her understand the difference between protecting someone and controlling them. She said she'd been taught that good mothers never let their children stray from God, but now she was learning that forcing someone into faith through fear wasn't actually faith at all. Mom told me she was working through years of anxiety about not being religious enough, and that she realized the exorcism came from her own terror more than anything I'd actually done. It wasn't a perfect apology, but it showed she was trying to understand what she'd put me through. Dad made more effort to connect with me too, asking about school and my friends without making everything about religion. One Saturday afternoon, he knocked on my door and asked if I'd show him some of my music, saying he wanted to understand what I liked about it. I was nervous because I expected him to criticize it, but I pulled up a few songs that meant something to me and explained why I connected with them. Dad sat there with my headphones on, really listening, and when he finished, he said the music wasn't his style, but he could hear the skill and artistry in it. He admitted he didn't hear anything evil or dangerous, just heavy guitars and intense vocals, and that he was sorry for assuming the worst without ever actually listening. That conversation meant more to me than any apology because it showed Dad was willing to challenge his own assumptions instead of just accepting what Pastor Rick had told him. Around the same time, I decided to reach out to Evan Harding, the guy whose testimony about the facility I'd found online months ago. I wrote him an email thanking him for sharing his story and explaining how reading it had helped me avoid being sent there. I told him what happened with the exorcism and how his words had given me the courage to resist when my parents wanted to send me away. Evan wrote back within a few days, and his response was encouraging and kind. He said he was glad his story had helped someone, and that exposing these places required people willing to tell the truth about what really happened there. He told me that if I ever felt ready to speak up about my own experience, my voice could help other kids in similar situations. His message made me think about whether I wanted to share what happened publicly someday, but for now, I was just focused on healing and rebuilding trust with my family. 6 months after everything happened, my parents made the decision to officially leave their old church. Mom had been attending less frequently, and Dad had started questioning some of Pastor Rick's teachings during their therapy sessions. One Sunday morning, they told me they weren't going back, that they needed a break from that community and the pressure that came with it. Mom said she felt lighter without the constant need to prove her faith through extreme actions, and that she missed having a relationship with God that brought peace instead of terror. Dad admitted he wished they'd made this change years ago, that he'd let Pastor Rick have too much influence over their family decisions. They started visiting a smaller church that focused more on community service and less on spiritual warfare, and while Mom still struggled with some of the differences, she seemed more relaxed there. Our family wasn't perfect, and we still had difficult conversations about boundaries and what they expected from me versus what I needed for myself. But there was real healing happening in our house, the kind where I could disagree with my parents without fearing they'd call the church elders. I wasn't afraid in my own home anymore, and my parents were learning to love me without trying to fix or change who I was. We had bad days where old patterns came up, but we also had good days where we felt like a normal family again. I started thinking about college and looking at schools that were far enough away to give me independence, but close enough to visit if I wanted to. The idea of leaving home used to scare me, but now I looked forward to having more control over my own life and making decisions without constant supervision. I was grateful that I'd fought for myself when it mattered, and that my parents had ultimately been capable of change, even though it took a crisis to get there. The trauma from the exorcism would always be part of my story, and I still had moments where I remembered the hands holding me down and the oil running into my eyes. But that experience didn't define my entire future anymore, and I was proud of the strength I'd found when I needed it most.